Session in the Protect Association webinar series. I'm James Edmonds and I run the Protect Association. I've worked across insurance and financial services for nearly 20 years in strategy, customer experience, consumer duty and vulnerability roles. Fantastic to have over 660 people register for today's session. Such an important subject, so thank you all for registering and for joining. Today's session will be recorded and available on the Protect Association website shortly, and will run for about 45 minutes, followed by 15 minutes worth of questions. So please do post your questions in the chat on the Protect LinkedIn page, where we'll pick them up at the end. Also, a huge thank you to our 2025 sponsor, Voice. They support all of our webinar activity. It's been brilliant to have them with us this year. So today, we're talking about the new Chartered Insurance Institute's Managing Vulnerability in Insurance and Personal Finance Practical Implementation Guide. There's been a few webinars on this over the last couple of weeks. We wanted to do something slightly different. So instead of a presentation, it's going to be a proper discussion with the people behind the guidance, talking about applying it in practice. I'm joined by two excellent guests today. Vanessa Ribinoli, Head of Research and Insight at the Chartered Insurance Institute, the lead behind the new guidance, and Andrew Geffing, Managing Director of Morgan Ash, whose expertise in vulnerability assessment and data has fed into this work and has been helping firms operationalise these requirements for years with a bottom-up data-led approach. At a later date, we'll be running a session to explore the top-down approach to understanding vulnerability and monitoring outcomes for vulnerable customers with another author of the guide and Protect member, Martin Grimwood of FWD Consulting. Thank you both for joining. Okay, so setting the scene. Vanessa, Andrew, I'm going to start with something very current. So the CII launched the guidance last week, certainly created a lot of conversation, which has been great to see. Vanessa, over to you first. How have you found the reception so far? Is there anything of note in terms of how firms have responded or the kinds of questions you're hearing already?
Well, it's been a week and a day, and I'm really humbled and overwhelmed by the positive response that we've received so far, and the media coverage and the LinkedIn buzz. So a few things to note in terms of feedback. Nothing negative, that's the first thing. But for example, at the event itself, the FCA actually said that they very much welcome the leadership that trade and professional associations like the Chartered Insurance Institute are taking to translate principles into practice. We've heard also from the ABA good feedback that have flagged the guidance with their colleagues in their conduct team, and feedback from a London market firm that has already advised they will adapt the guidance and co-brand it for its internal use for their retail arm. Approach it in terms of no questions, but lots of approaches. So we've been approached by a number of charities, including STAMA, organizations like Plain Numbers, focused on making confusing numbers accessible to all, as well as innovative insurance firms that focus, for example, on travel insurance with people with health conditions. And also the British Standards Institute we have a meeting with them to discuss potential alignment with their vulnerability standard. In general, very, very positive. A bit of constructive feedback around pointing out that we haven't gone deep enough around the section of the guidance that covers customer journey mapping, but we could only go so far. So there will definitely be scope to enhance and evolve the guidance to look at those areas in a bit more detail next year.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, I can certainly appreciate from having mapped a few customer journeys in my time how helpful a bit more guidance would be around vulnerability and those types of journeys. So, Andrew, I'd like to get your view on it too. So, from conversations you've had over the last week, how do you think the market's reacted, particularly given that this represents a pretty big step forward compared with where most insurers and indeed wider financial services are in terms of data capability and vulnerability identification?
Yeah, no, all positive. I think the best comment I heard was someone who I know is working on vulnerability a lot and said, this is the Bible on what we need to do, and I thought that was for me very satisfying to hear that. Interesting. I haven't heard anything from the firms who are sort of pushing the paper approach, which I suspect they've now hopefully they've now gone, okay, a paper solution is probably not appropriate. So there, but I had no kickback, which is surprising because it is quite demanding. There's a lot of people who really hadn't got their heads around what was required. Just thought a bit of training would do it. And equally a few others have said, no, that's really good. It gives them something tangible they can take to their management and say, look, this is where the benchmark is now. Sure. It's not just a big gap of principles of which we could sort of float over and ignore. It's now much more tangible from that point of view, and it shows up. And indeed, if you go through some of the question sets at the end, sort of aid memoir question sets, it's pretty. I mean, they are written pretty stark. Are you doing this or are you not? Deliberately for that purpose. So hopefully it's given those guys, the sort of middle management, where senior management maybe has not been as put this on their priority list, maybe as high as it needs to be.
Yeah, it feels to me as if we're definitely moving away from the time where training a database, sometimes unfortunately based in Excel, and flags on a CRM is a suitable way to manage vulnerability. And I think just bringing firms along and ensuring that people realise that's actually not really the way that we need to be doing this anymore is a really positive step to take forward. So for this webinar in particular, obviously we promised people we'll be giving them good takeaways, telling them exactly what they needed to know from the guidance. So Vanessa, starting at the top, simple terms, what was the CII trying to achieve with this guidance and why now as well?
So before I talk about what we were trying to achieve, maybe for those of in the audience that aren't aware of what the Chartered Insurance Institute, we're very much a professional body that supports insurance and financial planning and exists to really drive and advance standards and professionalism for both firms and individuals. We have a royal charter, and under this royal charter, we have a public interest purpose. And this mandate really allows us to provide an independent forum where stakeholders can collaborate on shared challenges, such as this one around managing vulnerability. And over the past year, we've been running a program of roundtable events, focusing very much on vulnerability this year for a number of reasons, some of which just building on some of the FCA's reviews that they have conducted, both in the board reports and the vulnerability guidance. They have identified a number of areas where firms are falling short and there's areas for improvement. And those areas include the requirement for having better data quality, recognizing that in order to be able to do cohort analysis and properly report and meet the obligations under the duty of evidence and good outcomes, there wasn't enough MI to be able to do that in an adequate way. Another area that is identified as an improvement area is having better data sharing across the distribution chain, and the fact that many firms are not using data to inform how they do service improvements and how they incorporate that data into inclusive product and service design. And our own research also confirm that data is one of the biggest implementation challenges when it comes to implementing vulnerability management, with recognizing that firms struggle with knowing what data exactly to capture, how do they integrate that data across systems, and how can they show relationships between service improvement and then improved outcomes. So with all this in mind, as we engage with firms, we also kept hearing, we know what we need to achieve, but we don't really know how to do it, and we struggle on the implementation. So this is where we really identified a gap to help translate principles into practice. So that really drew us to start working on this guidance, and we had two main objectives. So one was recognizing that there's already a lot of guidance that exists around training, customer disclosure, inclusive design, and we really wanted to bring under one umbrella, under one master document, all existing good practice guidance that exists and point to relevant resources. But mainly we wanted to address the biggest gap, which, as I said, is data. And this is where implementation many times falls short or breaks down. And this really is where we go deep here.
Yeah. And Andrew, when you look at what the CII has created, obviously with yourself and other contributors as well, does it align in terms of what you see day to day and the real challenges for organisations? Do you think that the challenge in the guidance goes far enough? And does it nail everything that you think it needs to?
To nail everything, you could go on for longer, but it does. I think it really attacks the main problem, and just to wind back a bit, I think when you look at the original consumer duty documentation, the vulnerability guidance was a separate document, FG 21.1. The way the consumer duty was written, it talked about training frontline staff a lot. And so, and people were focused on fair value and doing those sort of things, and the board reports and so forth. And the vulnerability bit sort of didn't, just the way it sort of came across really wasn't top of the list. But since then, I think now everyone realizes the vulnerability piece is the hardest piece of consumer duty. And I boil it down into, what you need to do. So the first thing is you need to understand the consumer and prevent putting them in harm. And everyone gets that. And indeed, most firms are doing that on an individual basis. The second thing is you need to be able to monitor that over the lifetime of the product. And for most people, we're talking many years. So you need some records to do that. And that's where it starts getting struggling. Yeah. You then need to be able to look at that across the value chain. You need to be able to report on that. And then you've got the reporting against your outcomes. You need to be able to say, okay, I can see that, those with mental health are getting worse outcomes than the resilient. Yeah. And then from that, go back and adapt your product or your service to try and mitigate or minimize that problem. So it's that second part, or those last several points then, which really struggle because you need data to do that. And indeed, the FCA have said, repeatedly now in their various reports and reviews, you need data, and you need to look at that data, and you need to look at the outcomes across the value chain. But that is, and that's the nub of it. So how do you do that? What data do you need? And that's very specifically what we're trying to solve. We try to say, okay, this is the data you need to be able to do that. Or who is a model? There may be others, but to be honest, I haven't seen any. This is the type of data you need, and then details of what that data may be and how it may work and so forth. So we've attacked the main problem. And I think if you get that right, you're 80-90% the way there to really managing vulnerability.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So just quickly, I can see comments coming through. So Chris, Catherine, and Spencer, thank you for your comments so far. So if people can keep the questions and comments coming through, that'd be fantastic. Jeff, we've just seen yours. We will get to all of those at the end. So thank you, and keep those coming. So delving a little bit deeper now into why data is so important. Vanessa, the guidance goes really deep into data structures, taxonomies, system capability, and monitoring. Some people will look at that and say it feels very technical. Why is data at the heart of this?
Well, Andrew just mentioned, you need to be able to identify, monitor, track customers across the value chain, report, analyze, support. You need data to do all of that. Manual processes or adding notes to a CRM are just expensive and inefficient, and continue to refer back to the FCA's emphasis on data being an area where firms are falling short. Without structured data, staff waste time searching notes, deciding actions. There's no real way to report or conduct cohort analysis. So, for example, so thinking about some of the things that need to be in place for good vulnerability management, you need to be able to identify vulnerable customers. Once you've done that, you need to be able to record consistently and in an objective way, not just yes, no, not just binary, because the people might present characteristics of vulnerability, for example, hard of hearing, but there's degrees of that. So there's levels of severity. And also recognizing, exactly that the fluid nature of vulnerability. You need to be able to systematically identify all vulnerable customers, not just that disclose at point of sale or at point of claim. So in order to be able to do that, you need to have approaches that enable you to reach out proactively and be able to capture that data and record it consistently. And also, there's something about understanding the relationship between harms and needs. And in the guidance, we talk about this fact and the fact that vulnerability is contextual and that people aren't inherently vulnerable. Harm can appear, for instance, when a customer circumstance intersects with a firm's specific services. As an example, a customer with a gambling addiction faces less potential harm when buying life insurance cover, which can be cancelled later, than when offered a high-risk investment or an instant credit. So in order to be able to identify those things, again, it just comes down to you need the data. And we provide some recommendations around how you can actually map those links between circumstances, firm activities, potential harms, support, implementation, and then monitoring outcomes as well. So thinking about, circumstances, you would need to capture things like the health condition, capability, or life event. So, for example, someone with early stage dementia might affect the customer's short-term memory and comprehension. The firm activity in this case would be the specific product or moment in the journey. So, for example, this customer has a home insurance policy that is due for renewal, and the potential harm would be that they lapse, therefore leaving them exposed to risk. So that would be the harm that they need to record. And then another thing to capture, for which you need data, is what practical adjustments can remove or reduce that potential harm. And there might be different options. So, for example, setting up a third-party authority or a trusted relative. And then the outcome would be another piece of data that needs to be tracked. In this case, lapse data that can allow you to kind of then do the analysis and identify whether that customer is actually getting the right outcomes. So all these things, again, like thinking about what needs to be in place for good vulnerability management, it all goes down to data. Without data, you can't actually track all these things. And other things, thinking about if you're a smaller advisor or you've got a high turnover, if you don't have data and just rely on what sits in people's heads when people move on, how do you ensure continuity? How do you ensure that clients continue to be served in the same consistent and standardized way? I could go on and on and on and on. So there's many reasons why data is fundamental, and that is why the FCA is also flagging that as a area for improvement.
Yeah, I think your point around vulnerability being not a binary issue is just so pertinent. I often worry that the FCA's numbers around, circa 50% of your customers will be vulnerable, leads firms to think that that's a huge administrative burden that is going to be placed on the organisation if they begin to investigate vulnerability further. But the point you make about how a vulnerability intersects with the actual product or service being offered and the appropriate action, therefore, that needs to be taken. Those are the avenues that firms need to begin to go down. That's the way to begin to think about vulnerability management, not this vulnerable, non-vulnerable, how on earth do we deal with this person who's experiencing a certain set of circumstances. So, Andrew, when you hear what Vanessa spoke about, how does that align with Morgan Ash, the Mars system, and what you're seeing in practice?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Most people thought thinks it's too easy, having a spreadsheet or, just some comment in a CRM system, but it's just totally inadequate. And you mentioned the 50%, and it is around 50%. All our work with all different organizations, obviously it varies and so forth. The biggest sort of, I say crime's not the right word, but perception is, people say, oh, we've got wealthy clients, we don't have any vulnerable customers, or very, very few, and we've got 2 or 3%. And you go, well, it's just not true.
Yeah.
What is true is, in that, if we say roughly that 50%, a large portion of that will be a relatively mild vulnerability, of which you probably don't need to do anything. So the proportion of people where you need to actually change your process is actually relatively small. I'd say it's in the sort of 10 to 15%. I mean, again, this is very holistic comments. And the vast majority of things that people need to do are actually relatively simple. I mean, it's just changing the communication method, understanding what they've got. So this fear about cost, I think, is totally not only unjustified, it's wrong, because actually it's costing people far more to put these things right than it is to understand it in the first place. So if you understand that person, has a stammer, for example, which is a lady came to the launch event was from the Stammer Association, as Vanessa mentioned. If you understand that, then you can make accommodation of how you communicate with that person. And if you know what that is, then the customer has a far better time. Your staff having a much better time over the phone if they're speaking to them. So it's just that little bit of information just makes life a lot easier for all parties, and you end up doing less complaints and less problems. Because all of those just take an enormous amount of time. And it does amaze me, some organizations are only looking at the complaints process for vulnerability. Now, admittedly, there will be a lot of vulnerability in the complaints area, but it's kind of looking, after the horse has bolted out the stable, it's looking at the wrong end of things. You should be, trying to stop this stuff at the beginning, and then that'll reduce your complaints. So, if you're having tons of complaints, that shows that something's going wrong, and it's costing a lot of money.
Yeah.
So, and kind of another anecdote, if you like, a financial advisor said to me, we always used to, before we did fact finds, we did all the financial assessments and everything in our heads and bits of paper and so forth. And then, fact finds came in, which basically meant we had to keep a record of these in a far more diligent process, so it's auditable. And we're just doing the same for vulnerability.
Sure.
So whereas fact find is all information to protect us as an organization from a risk point of view, vulnerability is all about personal information and protecting the consumer. So, it's just saying, actually, we need to hold and manage that information just the same, way. Whereas at the moment it's in people's heads, and of course that gets, it doesn't last that long. It's not transferable and so forth.
Sure. Andrew, to put me on the spot a little bit. So rarely do I speak to an organisation who tell me they want to discover more vulnerable customers. I think most firms think that they are still doing the right thing, but I think that they are actually doing less in practice than they believe they are doing.
Yeah.
And again, in these conversations, these firms will say invariably they're at between probably 2 and 8% of customers identified as vulnerable. Excel databases and flags still viewed as acceptable. Does that represent the reality that you find?
Yeah. No, absolutely. And indeed, you speak to vulnerable groups and charities and things and disabled groups and so forth, and they'll say, no one's ever asked us. If they'd asked, I would have told you. Or, I've told the organization 20 times that I've got this issue. And clearly they're not recording that information. or if it's been recorded, it's buried in some system which no one else in the organization can see. So it's a fundamental, just getting the basics right is being able to record this in a way that anyone who's dealing with that customer or process which is dealing with that customer then knows that information and doesn't repeat the same mistakes. And that's really simple. It's sort of the basics of vulnerability management. Understand what the issues are, or we'd call it circumstances. Understand what the needs are, the support needs are, which could be just communicating by email or something simple, and then making sure that everyone in the organization, all the processes, are using that. And that sounds simple. In practice, of course, organizations have acquired organizations. They've got legacy systems. They'll have a pricing portal. They'll have onboarding processes, different systems in the call center. So maybe even different brands and that sort of stuff before they've acquired organizations. So trying to share information within these systems is actually really, really difficult. And I think people look at these things internally and go, okay, well, we'll bring all these together, but then 6 months later, the firm acquires another organization, and that's another set of things. So the sort of single customer view where people approach is, by all means, it's a great in theory, but in practice, are you beginning to hold that information? And some of the systems we know are legacy and old and product, and they're product focused. There's nothing there to be custom focused. It is really introducing a whole new set of personalization information about the customer, which you can share in between multiple different systems, and that's the way to look at it.
I think thinking about proactive engagement and why it's needed, there's the guidance really focuses on wanting to help firms move from just reactive fixes to be able to have strategies in place to be more proactive and be more anticipatory. And actually, the FCA also talks about that the need or the requirement for firms to really understand the nature and scale of characteristics of vulnerability that exist within their customer base, and they focus on that because if you can identify the proportion of your customer base that has or is at a higher risk to be exposed to certain vulnerable circumstances, then you can plan ahead what support are you going to put in place for when that individual contacts you or discloses or is identified as such. So it's kind of that combination between proactive and reactive identification to be able to have strategies in place to support customers when they actually are identified as being in a vulnerable circumstance. So really kind of focusing on that hybrid approach that combines both reactive means of identifying customers in vulnerable circumstances through transactions or disclosure or assessments, and that more kind of proactive approach that can be achieved through outreach programs or customer surveys, for example, or even using data analytics, always with bearing in mind that if you identify potential people that are at harm of being in a vulnerable circumstance through data analytics, you always need to confirm with that individual that might be the case rather than taking it as pure factual data.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, we're going to move on to data structures and GDPR now. So the biggest blocker firms often raise are indeed GDPR rules and regulations. So the guidance though is very clear that vulnerability data can be stored lawfully. Vanessa, can you explain how firms should think about this?
It's complex. I'm not an expert. The CII is collaborating with experts to drive to produce a guidance document around managing vulnerability data in a compliant way. However, it is true that it's probably one of the most common objections that we hear, and we tackle it in the guidance at a bit of a high level, as I said. But the key thing to bear in mind is that UK GDPR doesn't prohibit processing vulnerability data. The ICO, the Information Commissioner Office, is practical and wouldn't prevent organizations and firms to actually manage vulnerability data for good customer outcomes. So what firms do require to have in place is systems that allow data to be managed appropriately, and that means not manual processes, not Excel spreadsheets, and also most importantly to do it on a lawful basis. So for example, explicit consent. And surrounding that, there needs to be robust security systems, clear governance, and utmost respect for the data subject rights as well. So I suppose the key is to build or procure compliant systems, not to avoid collecting necessary data from the outset. So yeah, as I said, we'll be following up with more detailed guidance on how to be compliant with UK GDPR, but it is one of the biggest myths that we hear, and there's some fear around that.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, just to add to what Vanessa said, the GDPR, GDPR hasn't changed. Firms already store personal data and health data. So, simply just apply the existing processes you have, or from a permissions point of view, to this data. I do find it quite amazing when some people say, oh, we need ICO to tell us, for example, how long to retain vulnerability data. Well, vulnerability data is no different than any other personal information from that point of view.
Yeah.
So the answer is retain it as, apply the same process as to what you already do.
Yeah.
What I think is scary is when firms are saying, oh, we're not going to do anything until the ICO tells us how long we need to retain that data. Because if you, at the moment, we have quite a, the GDPR is principle-based regulation, just like consumer duty, and it's then open for interpretation by each organisation.
Yeah.
If we want them to get more specific, then, and they do, provide more specific, I don't think they will, but if they did, we might find actually we're in a lot of trouble because, simple things like for contracts which don't go ahead, how much you're being deleted. Well, I know an awful lot of organizations who are not deleting as diligent as they should be contracts which are not going ahead. They're effectively storing data longer. Now, no one's been fined by there because there's no harm being occurred, so but if we want to raise our head above the parapet and ask for specifics, we might find ourselves actually digging a large hole. So I just put that war sort of perspective on people who are immediately sort of jumping off and saying, oh, we can't do this because of GDPR. It's just not true. It's just not true. The answer is you need systems which are capable of storing the data and managing the data, deleting the data and so forth in a GDPR compliant fashion. And in reality, most organizations haven't got that, especially if they're just writing text in a CRM, in some existing system.
One area that we've received good feedback, which covers an aspect of GDPR, which is overcoming the data minimization requirements. So we do talk about approaching the data structures in a multi-tiered system, a bit like credit scoring providers just provide kind of the score, but not the underlying information around vulnerability and circumstances. And this is very important to be able to share data compliantly and responsibly internally, but also to enable inter-firm data sharing, which is also required. So for example, you could think of having a high-level indicator, for example, a flag or a color code or a simple rating that can be shared widely within the firm. And this allows all relevant staff to know that a certain customer may require a special consideration without any access to the sensitive personal data that sits on the underneath that. So it's kind of looking at this kind of approach of having a multi-tiered system where you've got a generic flag or an indicator that something needs to happen, and that is shared with certain people, and then the people that need to be more involved in the support have access to a more granular level of detail that has recorded the need, the vulnerability severity, the area of vulnerability that needs to be addressed, what support is needed, and that is an approach that we've received good feedback around, this multi-tiered approach to structuring data with role-based access.
Sure. Excellent. Thank you both. So I suppose in short, there's no real situation where GDPR prevents firms from doing this properly. So certainly something to look to move on from. We're going to move on to outcomes and reporting, conscious of time and how much discussion there is ongoing. Vanessa, the FCA has shifted to principles with proof. Reporting on customer vulnerability outcomes is very difficult without structured data. What do you think good reporting begins to look like now?
In the guidance, we talk about a framework, and I'll cover kind of like the different steps that need to be, or we recommend that are in place within organizations, or the things that they need to think about in terms of an outcome reporting framework. And it all starts with defining what good and bad outcomes look like, and identify clear what is the definition of success. And then move on to mapping how firms you will achieve it. So you first define, then you map the activities, processes, and controls that the firm uses to deliver to those defined outcomes. And then you move on to establishing a limited number of measures or metrics that enable you to monitor those outcomes. To identify whether vulnerable customers interact with services differently, the FCA actually suggests sources such as direct customer feedback or complaint root analysis, or as the example that I was talking about before in terms of the interplay between harms and needs. An outcome there would be monitoring lapse data. There's also a need to, part of this define, map, measure. The next step would be to identify those customers who experience poor outcomes through ongoing monitoring, and you can only do that if you capture, if you record data on your customers, and you're able to segment by cohort and conduct cohort analysis. And lastly, once you have identified those customers that are receiving poor outcomes, what service improvements are you putting in place to address those poor outcomes that you've identified after you've done the root cause analysis, and then kind of start all over again. One of the frameworks that we suggest firms adopt is using OKRs, objective and key results, to measure outcomes. So for larger firms, this would be moving beyond simply tracking activities. So for example, number of staff trained, and adopt an outcome-based measurement framework like OKRs, providing a clear line of sight between the firm's actions and their impact on the customer. So the objective would be very much focusing on the what, that is the qualitative, ambitious goal. An example of an objective would be, for vulnerable customer outcomes, would be to make sure that different vulnerable customer cohorts receive the same outcomes and consistently, and are not disadvantaged by the circumstances. So that would be kind of the what are we trying to achieve? The key results and the metrics that can be put in place would be, for example, a reduction of the vulnerability value gap. So that would entail measuring that there's a decrease in the differential in claims acceptance rates between vulnerable and non-vulnerable cohorts from X% to below Y% by year end. And this is kind of an approach and a framework that shifts the focus from we have completed a task, so we have achieved a better outcome for those customers. So we provide these two frameworks that work hand in hand. One is around the overall way of being able to define what good looks like, map the activities that are relevant to achieve those good outcomes, measure metrics, identify poor outcomes, and then implement service improvements. And the step around measuring metrics, you can use OKRs as a way of focusing on outcomes rather than activities.
Sure. Okay, thank you, Vanessa. I'm going to move us on a little bit. I've got two key questions I'd like to ask you both before we go to the questions and discussion that's been coming in, which I'm struggling to keep up with, I must admit. Right, so data sharing in the future, one area I very much want your views on. So the guidance said firms should move towards, but acknowledges this is something that will need more work in 2026. How realistic is that data sharing up and down the value chain and with other providers of financial services?
I think it's very realistic. I think it's massively needed. I also think from the consumer point of view, the industry generally thinks, oh, we don't share that data at the moment. So that'd be a big challenge. But there's no evidence to show the consumer doesn't think we already share that data, because we provide lots of information, on quotes and these sort of things. And we don't tell the consumer, actually, we're not sharing information about you. We're only sharing the product information with your manufacturer, for example. So why wouldn't you share it? So I think that's the starting point thing, is actually consumer probably expects it. I think the how to do it all comes down to the data structure. If you have good solid data, then you can transfer it from different organizations. Obviously, once you've got permission to do that. But again, asking someone to say, look, I've given all this information to the broker, for example, the mortgage. You already be signing to share the information with the lender for anyway. Sure. So what's the difference between this information, which is actually in the customer's interest? Sure. So we obviously need to check terms, conditions, and check consent and so forth. But I think people think it's actually a huge problem when actually it isn't. The problem is, where is the data to start with? And if it is, on spreadsheets, it's comment in CRM systems, there's no way for you to get that out and share it. So you need it in a format which can be shared. And I think that's once you have that, then and firms will have different formats and so forth. But that's okay. You can parse data. You can, we're good at doing that. In our Mars tool, we have data from VRS, which goes in and out from VRS. We can represent data as in what's called the preferential service register, which is what the utilities use for vulnerability. You can represent in that format. And indeed, we link into we use the same information as the Money Advice Trust to have a help on support network. We replicate all of those. So there's different formats which you can actually share between the two.
Sure.
Yeah, I'd say we did a roundtable around data sharing, and there were barriers identified across, like cultural barriers. Firms are not used to doing it, or there might be commercial sensitivities, etc. But there's also technical barriers, which are lack of interoperability between firms. And one of the things that the CII has committed next year is to establish a cross-sector data sharing task force to try and address some of these challenges. And we'll be working and focusing on that next year.
Super. Okay, thank you, Vanessa. Right, I'm going to give you 30 seconds each to answer the next question. So if you're running an insurer or a broker today, what are the first 3 actions you would take after reading this guidance? Andrew, you're first.
Wow. So yeah, think about where your data's stored. Think about how you're getting consistency. And if you haven't already got that nailed, then think how you're going to solve that. And are you going to build something, or are you going to buy it?
Sure. I don't know if that's 1 or 3, but I'll take it. Vanessa?
And on build or buy, we've got some guidance as well around like what to look out for when you engage with vendors, or whether you want to build it internally. I would say we'll need to get the basics right. Do we have the basics right? And that means that we can't begin to think about how to manage vulnerability if we don't understand who is vulnerable and who is not. I would say I would not aim for perfection from the outset. I would implement progressively, iterate and pilot. And third, I would document what we're doing and why we're doing it, and learn from those pilots and that progressive implementation.
Super. Okay, thank you, Vanessa. So for these webinars, I normally prepare a few questions that I can ask if there's no interaction with the audience, but I'm not going to need those today, which is good to see. I think having tried to scan the chat, I'm going to send out a thanks to Richard Jackson, to Caroline Delahanty, and to Spencer Collins for doing some really good answering of questions that are already in there. So thank you very much for those. And obviously, people can continue the chat on this particular webpage if they want to do that, and if they want to get answers. I'll have another look after the webinar to ensure that everyone has got some necessary feedback or answers. But I'm just going to try to go through and pick out some pertinent questions that I can see. So Jeff Heasman, we're going to go to the first one that you put on right at the beginning. So I failed to see how any online sales comply with the consumer duty when it comes to checking understanding, which is essentially critical when it comes to vulnerable customers. Any tips? I was having very similar discussion to this with someone yesterday. Great question, Jeff.
Yeah, so I think if you're doing direct online sales, how do you make sure their understanding is difficult? And yeah, just flogging stuff to anyone that comes and buy it is no longer within consumer duty. So we tend to think more about the advice world and so forth, but actually, the advice world generally is overcoming all those issues about understanding. So yeah, I think it's a big challenge, and I think those organisations need to rethink how they're doing it, how they're doing that. We're linked into doing commercial loans for the moment as a credit company who is sending out questionnaires to on vulnerability and understanding that right up front. So you can do it digitally. That's all very possible. You can ask questions about to check the understanding, and I think it's moving away from this a very slick, quick, frictionless process, 2 clicks and you get your product, to adding in some friction to check that actually the customer understands it. Now that's going to be pretty unpopular, and people won't like me saying that, but I think I struggle to find otherwise how you're going to do that in those environments.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, we're going to move on to David Bassen's question. David, I'm going to take the liberty of editing your question slightly. So I'm going to rephrase it to: how should implied or suspected vulnerability be tracked and managed?
So implied vulnerability. So implied vulnerability, just for me to get my head around the question, is if you think if someone lives in this say a poor socioeconomic area, and hence you think is probably in poor financial position, for example, or you're looking at some transactional data and that's implying that they may have a certain applied to gambling sites. So you need to go and check with the consumer themselves if that its situation is actually true. And hence I think if you're a bank or you've got huge volume, for example, it could be really helpful for flagging up someone who's changing circumstance, for example, but then you need to go direct to consumer and hold that data. GDPR does talk about accuracy of data, and if you don't go and check with the consumer, you've got to be pretty sure that implication is true. Otherwise, you're holding data which is not necessarily accurate. So it absolutely, implied data has its place, but it is a different quality of data, if you like, and you can't just assume that that's vulnerability data. So it's another it's another tranche of data from that point of view. You can't assume that that's that's fact. It is implied. It is a suggestion. It may be really helpful for someone getting changing of circumstances, for example.
Okay, thank you. Vanessa, anything to add?
just to summarize, don't treat inferred data as factual data until you verify with the customer.
Okay, lovely. Thank you, Vanessa. Right, Spencer Collins has also been extremely proactive in helping to answer some questions in here. So thank you, Spencer. I see you've entitled one question in capitals, therefore I will no doubt read it out for you. So, how are call centres supposed to meet consumer duty when a customer's disability affects speech, processing speed, or memory, and the advisor has to balance fair treatment, accurate identification of vulnerability, adaptive communication, evidencing outcomes, and GDPR constraints, all while keeping the interaction efficient enough to avoid causing further harm? Spencer, great question. I cannot believe quite often how much responsibility is loaded onto contact centre employees, expected to be experts in absolutely everything, including vulnerability, which is just totally unreasonable. But Andrew or Vanessa, any responses to this?
I think, yeah, you're spot on. There's undue pressure on frontline staff many times, and that reliance historically and traditionally on just training just isn't enough, because as you said, you're trying to meet SLAs, you're trying to be empathetic, and you also need to remember all the different vulnerability characteristics that the firm might interact with. This is because having the right processes and systems that support frontline staff to be able to ask objective assessments and record data systematically is fundamental, rather than just relying on the individual skills and ability to manage all those complex situations, in situations where you have people talking about traumatic situations that also have a psychological impact on frontline staff. So yeah, I think it comes down to having systems and processes that support call center staff. But Andrew, you can add to that.
And so in that situation, you would hope that your vulnerability management system records that person already has those issues with communication, already records that the challenge to the consumer and their preferred communication method, which, if they're having trouble with speech, then they may prefer to use text, they may prefer to talk with someone else. And then if someone does phone in, is it actually someone else? So I think an example just came to me the other day where someone was dyscalculic and wanted their partner to be able to speak to the organization, and the organization would allow it. Well, if that was on the system saying, actually speak to someone else, you don't do a transaction, not necessarily approve, any money transfer and anything else, but you would be able to explain to a trusted third party. So, that's where having the data, is crucial, as opposed to lumping it all on the Paul call center agent, who's got to, quite frankly, is put in an impossible situation.
Thank you. So there's some good discussion as well. This was following on from Jeff's comment around ultimately how online sales can comply with consumer duty. And Spencer made the comment, ditch all of the I confirm I've read this nonsense, drop in quick scenario choices, swipeable micro quizzes, and what would you do next prompts. If someone keeps getting it wrong, then reroute them to real support. That's how you prove you're not just ticking boxes. We spoke a moment ago about inserting a bit more friction into the buying process. Do those recommendations from Spencer feel like they would actually work within an organisation? If I know from, you would get anyone involved in the commercial side of the organisation saying, why are we putting these barriers in place when it comes to converting new business? Unfortunately, those are the numbers that many organisations care about first and foremost. Obviously, the answer is going to be we need to strike a balance, but could you see those types of scenarios working? Is there anything else that you've seen to imply customers' understanding is genuinely there, rather than the tick boxes, which, let's be honest, we all swipe down, tick, and carry on?
I'm not an expert in that area, I have to say, and I think it's in the infancy. And I think that where we are for the majority of organisations is, as you say, we're still very much commercially focused, and we haven't started doing that. So I do think there's a huge, progress to be made in that by adding, adding frictions, is what we all understand, but it's probably not a great terminology from that point of view. Adding diligence to do that. I must admit, I doing some transactions, and I get, oh, this is all done. I'm going, well, hold on a minute. I'm that's too quick. I don't necessarily want it this quick and fast, particularly doing a financial transaction.
Yeah.
So I do think the fear of commercial is overdone. And actually, I think if people were more diligent from that point of view, we'd end up with better product, better customers, and less complaints.
Sure.
So it's not just about the revenue number, that month, and the numbers which are absolutely a lot of firms are focused on. It's looking at actually at the downscale and look at the claims and complaints and going, well, actually we reduce that because we put a bit of friction up front, just to make sure people are getting the right product. Absolutely.
And I think also, breeding a culture of customer care is not something that an organisation will suffer because of. Happy and well-served customers getting good experiences and outcomes will be customers that buy more, stay longer, and refer others. So you can look at it from a one-to-one basis, but actually the overall improving the experience and outcomes has to be the objective of an organisation that's pursuing strong commercials at the same time. So some good discussion down here between Spencer Collins and Caroline Delahanty. So I think what we're sort of landing at here is that services need to be inclusive by design. So very much looking at things on a journey basis. Are there any sort of organisations, Andrew or Vanessa, that you've spoken to or worked with who have put a lot of effort or really done some good work around inclusive design around their journeys?
I think Andrew is a better place to answer this one.
I think there is a lot of good work going on. I mean, I defer to Caroline, who's an expert in this area, and indeed yourself, James, more than me. But I still think we've got a long way to go. I think generally, if we look back and go, the man from the Pru and the bank manager who knew all the personal information about their individuals and did all that. And then before they did the loan, what have you. And now we've moved to a digital world where that doesn't exist. We're only holding the digital information. We need to move full circle, and all that information, essentially, which used to be in the bank manager or the man from the Pru's head, is now available to us on a personalized basis. So there's the sort of overlap between embedded design, intrinsic design, which is designed for everyone, and then personalization, which is designed for just that individual. So and those two, and again, a lot of people tend to think those are black and white, but actually they complement each other massively. So there is some good work going on, but it tends to be in the minority rather than the majority.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you. And yes, Caroline is certainly an expert in that field, and as we said at the top, we're likely to do a webinar with both her and Martin Grimwood at a point in time as well around vulnerability. So good to see we've adopted the convention of putting in capitals in any question now, which is really helpful. So we'll make this the last one. But Caroline, thank you for your question. I thought we might have answered this earlier, so if there's no additional answers, then don't worry. But Caroline's question, we've got the guidance, we've seen some gaps. What should we do next?
CII is committing to continue to facilitate dialogue and collaboration in this space, as I mentioned, focusing on data sharing next year, and also expanding the current guidance with some of those gaps around going deeper into best practice around mapping customer journeys, and also co-discovery, as well as co-design.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you, Andrew. Any last comments?
Well, read the guidance. If you need any help, reach out. There is a lot of help out there. And is that help you need in raising the issue with management? Is it, if it is, oh yeah, okay, right, we need to change our systems. How's that going to be? So the large organizations, I see some really struggling because they just can't get the to raise it up sufficiently at management level.
Yeah.
So we can help with that. I mean, I think that's and indeed the CII is massively pushing for that, and indeed people will be notably falling behind, with regard to education and qualifications and that sort of stuff, unless they start to meet duty.
Sure. Excellent. Okay, thank you. I can see more questions and comments coming through. We won't have time for those today, but I commit to going back to each of those individually. So thank you for your contributions. And a huge thank you, obviously, to Vanessa and Andrew for such an open discussion today. There's a lot of noise in the market around vulnerability at the moment, so really valuable to be able to cut through that commentary and get the practical reality for organisations and the people shaping this work as well. So a special thank you again to our 2025 sponsor of our webinars, Voice. And if you'd like to watch this session again, the recording will be available on the Protect Association website. Any further questions, please keep posting them and I'll come back to all of them. Before we go, a quick reminder, if anyone watching today is not yet a Protect member and would like to join, please do get in touch with me. We're always looking to broaden out our community across insurance. We've also got a couple of spaces left for drinks only for our end of year celebration in London on the 11th of December. If you'd like to join us, again, contact me and I'll make sure that you are added to the list. So thanks again for joining us and we look forward to seeing you at the next session.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Cheers now. Take care. Can we say Happy Christmas, or is that too early?
Happy Christmas. We can.
We're in December, we could say that.
Happy Christmas.